For couples, 8 victims, 3 years, and not a single arrest. The Colonial Parkway cuts through the Virginia Peninsula like a scar that never fully closed. 23 miles of federal road running between Yorktown and Jamestown, skirting the York River, threading through forests so old they predate the nation itself. Rangers patrol it. Tourists photograph it. Families drive it on Sunday afternoons with the windows down, watching the light move across the water. And between 1986 and 1989, someone was targeting young couples along its borders. Someone who knew every pull-off, every blind curve, every isolated sandbar and logging road where a car could sit for hours before anyone thought to look. Someone who killed 8 people across 4 separate attacks and walked away every single time without leaving a name. It took 35 years to find that name. And when investigators finally announced it in 2024, one detail stopped everyone cold. The man responsible wasn't a drifter. He wasn't an outsider passing through. He was a local, a waterman who had spent his entire life working the rivers and inlets and backroads of Tidewater, Virginia. A man who knew these waters the way most people know their own neighborhood. And he had been dead for 4 years before anyone figured it out. His name was Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. The case that finally cracked everything open, the one that gave investigators the DNA match they needed, began at a rest stop on Interstate 64 in October of 1989. At the time, Anna Maria Phelps was just 19 years old. The man beside her was Daniel Lauer, 20, not her boyfriend, but her boyfriend's brother. She was doing someone a favor just by being there. They were hitchhiking, trying to get back to the peninsula. It was late. Someone pulled over and offered them a ride. That's what people did back then. You stood at the side of the road and trusted that most strangers were basically decent, because most of them were. And you got where you were going, and the whole thing became a forgotten footnote in the story of your life. That's how it was supposed to go. 6 weeks later, searchers found their bodies in a logging area roughly 40 miles from that rest stop. Remote enough that you'd have to know it existed to think of looking there. The decomposition made cause of death nearly impossible to determine. What the scene told investigators wasn't how they died. It was that whoever brought them there had chosen the location in advance, had known it was there, had known it was isolated enough and obscured enough that it would buy time. Time, it turned out, was something this killer understood better than most. But here's what made Anna Maria and Daniel's case the final entry in something much larger. They weren't the first. They were the last. And to understand what that means, you have to go back to where it started. October 1986. A ranger driving the Colonial Parkway spots a car at one of the river pull-offs. Nothing unusual. People stop to look at the water all the time. But this car had been there too long. When the ranger approached, he found Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski inside. Both women were in their early 20s. Both were bound. Both were dead. The windows were rolled up. The doors were closed. Whoever had done this had parked them right there on a road that law enforcement drove multiple times every single day, and he simply walked away. That wasn't carelessness. That was confidence. A killer so certain he'd left nothing traceable that he didn't even bother to hide. 11 months later, the same geography, a different signature. David Nobbling, 20, and Robin Edwards, 14, were found on a sandbar near the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge in September 1987. Both had been shot. Their car had been repositioned after the fact, moved in a way that served no obvious practical purpose, as if the killer had stayed at the scene making deliberate choices about what investigators would see when they arrived. If the first scene was about brazen exposure, this one was about careful staging. 2 crimes, same stretch of Virginia, but different methods, which told investigators something deeply unsettling. This person wasn't locked into one approach. He was adaptable. He was thinking. Then Richard Call and Kathy Lee Dodge disappeared from a Yorktown beach in April 1988, and the case took on a different kind of horror entirely. No bodies were ever recovered. Only their car, abandoned, Richard's wallet still inside. No signs of a struggle at the scene. 2 people who had been somewhere and then simply weren't anymore. The absence of remains permanently closed certain forensic doors. For their families, it created a specific kind of grief, one without any physical anchor, without a burial, without the hard confirmation that the person you loved is gone rather than somehow, impossibly, still out there waiting to come home. 3 attacks, 6 victims, no arrests. And as the FBI quietly connected the threads, they realized a terrifying truth. The nightmare was far from over. The investigation that followed was fractured from the beginning. The Colonial Parkway is federal land, putting some cases under National Park Service and FBI jurisdiction. But the surrounding roads, the rest stops, the rural areas where bodies and cars kept appearing, those fell under county authority. York County, James City County, New Kent County, each with their own detectives, their own evidence storage, their own priorities. Nobody was holding the full picture at once. And the killer seemed to understand that too, because he kept operating right along the seams of those jurisdictions, in the gaps between agencies, in the places where a question asked in one county didn't automatically reach the next one over. The FBI's behavioral profile described someone almost certainly male, likely white, deeply embedded in the Virginia Peninsula. Not someone passing through. Someone who knew this landscape the way you know a place you've worked in for years. The pull-offs where a car wouldn't draw attention. The sandbars accessible only to people who knew the water. The logging roads that didn't appear on any standard map. The profile circulated. Names were investigated and cleared. Years turned into a decade, and then 2 decades, and the families were still waiting. Some of them refused to wait quietly. Pam Phelps, Anna Maria's sister, became one of the most persistent voices, showing up at press conferences, pushing investigators for updates, keeping the names alive in conversations that institutional inertia would have allowed to go silent. That kind of sustained advocacy costs something real. It means staying inside a grief that most people eventually step back from, keeping it active, keeping it loud, because the moment you stop pushing is the moment the world feels permission to forget. Pam didn't stop. Neither did the other families. For 35 years, they kept asking the same question. Who did this? And where are they now? The answer, when it finally came, arrived in the form of a joint press conference in January 2024. FBI agents and Virginia State Police stood together and said a name out loud for the first time. Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was not what the long-running investigative theories had predicted. He wasn't a former officer. He wasn't someone with insider knowledge of police procedure. He was a waterman, an oyster harvester, a clamor, a tree cutter who owned a small boat called the Denny and had spent his working life on the rivers and inlets of Tidewater, Virginia. He knew the isolated sandbars and the hidden logging roads not because he had studied them, but because they were part of his daily world. That local knowledge gave him the perfect cover. He could move through remote areas without raising suspicion. He could identify disposal sites that investigators wouldn't think to check. He could use the landscape as a tool because that landscape, in every practical sense, belonged to him. He had died in 2020. For years before anyone said his name in connection with what he had done. The DNA match linked him definitively to Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer, the couple at the rest stop, the final victims, the case that broke the 35-year silence. Investigators stated publicly that they believed he was responsible for all 4 pairs of victims. The behavioral consistency, the geographic specificity, the operational signature across all 4 attacks was too coherent to suggest otherwise. But the evidentiary standard for formal confirmation in the earlier cases couldn't be fully met. The evidence was degraded, or legally complicated, or simply gone. Which means that the families of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, of David Nobbling and Robin Edwards, of Richard Call and Kathy Dodge, they received something in January 2024 that was almost but not quite a complete answer. A conclusion they could believe without being able to officially hold. And for people who had been waiting 35 years, almost is a word with real weight behind it. Almost means the nightmare had a face and a name, but the courtroom door stayed closed. Almost means you know, but you can't prove it in the way the law requires, and there's nothing left to do with that knowledge except carry it. Wilmer lived for more than 30 years after the last murder. He worked his boat. He moved through the same communities where the families of his victims were still asking questions, still pushing, still refusing to accept silence as a final answer. Whether he thought about what he had done, whether he followed the investigation from the inside, whether the advancing sophistication of DNA technology ever registered to him as something worth worrying about, we have no way of knowing. He took all of that with him in 2020, leaving his victims' families to wait another 4 years for the truth to finally surface. What the 2024 announcement gave back was something essential, the restoration of a basic fact. What happened to these 8 people was real. It was specific. It was caused by one man who made deliberate choices across 3 years and 4 attacks and believed, apparently, that he had escaped the consequences permanently. He was wrong about that. It just took longer to prove it than it should have. Anna Maria Phelps was 19 years old, standing at a rest stop on a Virginia highway, trying to get home. Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were found on a road so familiar to local rangers that no one initially understood what they were looking at. David Nobbling and Robin Edwards were left on a sandbar that only someone who knew the water would have known to use. Richard Call and Kathy Lee Dodge simply vanished, leaving behind a car and a wallet and 35 years of unanswered questions. None of these families asked for what happened to them. None of them signed up for 3 decades of pushing against institutional walls, of keeping names alive that the world kept trying to file away. They did it anyway, because the alternative was letting the people they loved disappear twice. Once to a killer on a Virginia road, and once to the silence that follows when no one keeps asking. The answer came. Late, incomplete, attached to a man 4 years in the ground, but it came. And it came in large part because the people who loved these victims refused to stop making noise until someone listened. That's not a small thing. In a case that stretched across 4 decades and multiple jurisdictions and the limits of what forensic technology could do, the family's refusal to go quiet may have been the single most important factor in keeping the investigation alive long enough for the science to catch up. The rest stop on Interstate 64 is still there. The Colonial Parkway still runs its 23 miles between Yorktown and Jamestown, still catches the afternoon light off the York River the way it always has. Most people who drive it today are just passing through, thinking about where they're headed, not about what happened along its edges between 1986 and 1989. That's fine. That's what it means for the world to keep moving. But keeping moving is not the same as forgetting. And the families of 8 victims spent 35 years making sure the world understood the difference.